And obviously then the next set of questions are, well, how much do you really need? You know, what I've seen is very often people just think about, okay, here's the next set of milestones I want to get to. Let me just raise that much money and be done. Actually, it's very helpful to think about all the capital you have to raise until you become sustainable. And by sustainable, I mean that your cash out is less than your cash in and enough to pay all the bills. Right. And the reason it's useful to think about that is the kind of people you'll reach out to raise money will really be determined by how much capital and over what period of time you have to raise the capital. Because the different class of investors, which I'll delve into in a moment. And then it's the issue of, okay, once you've got those different sort of capital raises, what are you planning to accomplish with that? You know, what kind of milestones are you targeting? And what's the best time to raise the money? I think the timing piece is very critical, and quite frankly, the elements that you control and elements that you don't control, like what happens in the stock market. You can have the best business plan, the best sort of product, and the market changes from under you, you're kind of dead in water. There's not much you can do about it. And you know, one of the things you learn as you're building a company as an entrepreneur is you focus on things you control and not on things that are outside of your control. But it's very important to understand that they have an influence. So if things do work out differently, you can at least deconstruct and sort of draw the right lessons rather than blaming yourself for everything that goes south, which very often it does. But the main thing is figuring out how much capital for what, and then what's the road going to be like to sustainability when you actually don't need any more capital. Your revenues can sustain the business. So in terms of, you know, what are the sources of capital? When we start out, typically very often it's our own money, you know, or you reach out to your friends and family. They know you, they like you, so they decide to put money behind you. There are different angel groups. You have individuals who who invest as angels, but you also have different consortia, groups that get together. So in Seattle, for example, you have the Alliance of Angels, you have the Keiretsu Forum, and there are quite a few others. There's a group focused on just medical as well. So and typically angel groups are investing in the early stages, but not completely early. You already have to have something that's demoable, that you can show, an understanding of what problem you're solving, some technology that you can showcase. And the investment level could be anywhere from a few $100,000 to $1 million, $1.5 million. So still it's very early stage. And what's interesting is, you know, the mindset that the angels bring to this conversation is very different from the other class of investors I'll talk about. Because very often they will get involved. Yes, ideally, you know, they want to get a good return as well. But in practice, what happens is many of the angel investors, they've done well in their other enterprises, and they would set aside maybe $100,000 or $200,000 to invest in startups, right? So typically, their individual investments are hardly more than 10 or 20K, right? Now, there are super angels who write $1 million checks, and there are very few in Seattle, but in the Silicon Valley, you have quite a few so-called super angels who will write a few $1 million checks and also end up owning a chunk of the company. But what I've observed is for angels, it's more about how much they resonate with what you're trying to do in the company and how much they resonate with you. So the chemistry and the interaction you have with the angels actually are the biggest determinant of whether you get funding or not. So so it is a relationship game here. When you look at venture firms, they're operating at a very different scale. I mean, typically they will come later when you've de-risked more of your technology, more of your product, and perhaps a little bit of the market as well, and you have some traction in the marketplace. Now, different venture firms have different criteria, but by and large, you know, they are investing because they think there are reasonable chances you'll hit it big. So they're looking for larger returns. They're willing to write larger checks. They'll also take a bigger chunk of the company. And they'll probably insist on having some control or representation on how the company is run. So they'll go for board seats and such. There are other sources of capital that are less popular but can be very helpful if you know how to navigate. They're strategic partners. So to the extent you understand what you're building, what markets you're building for, and you do a value chain analysis, you can actually figure out who else is relevant in the value chain. And very often these companies have small investment groups or as part of business development, they actually have capital set aside to invest in companies that can help them in their main business. Now you have to be very careful when you work with the strategic investors because they are already in the game, right? And many of the strategic investors use their investment arm as a way to get market intelligence and then inform their product offerings internally. So it's not unusual that you can be talking to a strategic investor company and then everything goes quiet and 2 years later they launch a competitive product. So you have to be very, very careful. And by the way, this is not a theoretical thing. It's happened multiple times, happened to us. And if offline you want to ask me who the company was, I'm happy to share that too, but not on the record here. Okay, it's being broadcast, so who knows? But they can be a very important source of capital because they can bring the network and the understanding of the market, and in a true collaboration that can be very effective. So there are all kinds of structures, but the most common one is they would take less than 20% because that's the threshold above which they have to then report on corporate P&L, right? So, and they will not take control because that also reduces their likelihood that, oh, you will go after them. And frankly, as an entrepreneur, you don't want to give them any kind of control. And frankly, they will insist on information rights. So an observer seat or such, but most of them do not go for a board of director position. They are taking equity. And then sometimes they would negotiate certain rights, and that's another thing you have to be very careful about. Some of them, if they think you're, how do I put it politely, relatively new to the game, they will try to get first right of refusal. That you don't want to give. I mean, that will hamper your ability to raise money down the road because essentially it caps the kind of outcome and the buyers if you have given those rights. So I would say you want to bring them in strictly as sort of get them money. Sometimes it would make sense for you to give them distribution rights for certain geographies. And that's how they justify internally why they're making the investment. So they get early dibs on what you have and then some rights that have value. But you don't want to give them right of first refusal. That can be really problematic. Although if they're writing huge amounts of checks and and sometimes they may also negotiate a predetermined price that they will buy you if you hit certain milestones. But the right way of doing it is it's not an exclusive, so it still doesn't prevent you from going to others. And Cisco does this a lot. So yeah, there are all these nuances you have to understand, and really you have to understand why they're doing it. And those are some of the things I'll talk about. For each of these class of investors, you have to understand why they're doing it and what are they looking for and what's their agenda. That's the most important thing, and it takes a huge amount of work to understand what their agendas are, and sometimes you have to extrapolate because nobody tells you. This other class of money available comes with more strings. You can actually go to the banks. Many of the banks will loan you capital, but you will end up putting up your house or your firstborn as collateral. And you know, that may or may not be a good outcome. So if the company goes south, your house goes as well. There are other kinds of things banks have started to do. They will loan you money against revenue collateral. So essentially, if you already have revenues and you have a good pipeline, they will loan you against that. But they will have rights to all the revenues for X number of years. Again, they will give you traditional kind of loans, which means collateral, right? So as soon as you have to put up collateral, and if you're early in the career, you probably don't have a collateral. I mean, you may not have a house, you know, you may not have any of the assets they consider collateral worthy. And their comfort with taking equity, it varies. I think Silicon Valley banks of the world, they're a lot more sophisticated, so they probably have flexibility and structures to accommodate, but there are pros and cons, but without collateral, it's very, very difficult, unless they already know you and they can assess your risk. Let's see. Yeah, I think so. And the other source of capital is really revenue. If you can figure out a way to get customers to prepay, and this is something that we tried to do in Movisante, but the customers who agreed to initially prepay us got so excited they wanted to come in as investors. But I think revenues and customers, that's a pretty significant source, especially if you're close enough to get to the market. Each of these capital sources have trade-offs, right? And from your perspective, the big trade-off about how much you raise and when you raise is about dilution and flexibility. So if you raise a lot of money up front, well, you're giving up. I mean, in the early stages, the cost of capital is really high. You don't have a lot, right? So whoever is investing, to de-risk their sort of investment, they will try to get a bigger chunk of the company, right? So that's dilution. On the other hand, if you're making sure you have enough money coming in, you can hit the milestones without having to go back to investors. So it is a trade-off that you have to sort of make for yourself, and this is why it's important to do the analysis up front. What's the total amount of capital you'll need through the life of the company to get to sustainability? And then break it down in chunks where you think your valuation will have a big jump, right? So, and some of the standard sort of milestones are, well, you have de-risked your technology, or you have a product, or you have de-risked your market, i.e. you actually have evidence that there are some paying customers. So all of these things essentially increase the value of the company. And those are good times to go raise money because capital will be cheaper than before those milestones. Many investors, whether angels or VCs, even though VCs say they bring a whole bunch of other things to the table, I mean, fact of the matter is most investors is just money. All right, they'll write a check. Then it's a matter of, well, can you find investors who will be able to do more positive things for the company? And the most important one is, can they help you in follow-on fundraising? Because ultimately, chances are very high you'll need more capital than you thought you needed, and you'll have to keep going back to the well. And the most important partnership to help you raise follow-on money is the people who already are invested. And to the extent that they have network with larger VC firms or VC firms that have co-invested with them, that makes a big difference. The other thing to be really, really mindful of is the integrity and reputation. And I will go over where things can go south. If you have doubts about the integrity and of the people you're working with, walk away. You will be much happier. Walk away. This is completely unequivocal. Any doubt, because your life will get miserable if you work with these people. And it can be at the level where the game's like, oh, you get a term sheet and you've already spent $40,000 in legal fees to turn that term sheet into a contract, and then change things at a material level. And all kinds of fun and games happen. So that's the one big thing to watch out for. And then see, especially for strategics, do they have the network and the relationships to help you get to the market as well? And can they inform your sort of market strategy, and can they bring some intelligence as well? And there, like anything else, you have really good investors, really engaged investors. And there's a negative side. There are certain kind of engaged investors you don't want. And what I mean by that is there are a class of people who think they know, who want to, many people use investment as a way to get their next job. All right, and this is something you have to watch out for. And many of them show their cards earlier, some later. And ultimately, you're bringing in the capital and the partners to help you build the business. So you want to make sure there's alignment. And when you see those disconnects, those are red flags, warning signs you have to really pay attention to, which is a hard thing to do because you so want the money. All right. So I'll give you an example. I think a year and a half into Movisante, we were approached by a private equity out of Tennessee. And they essentially agreed to all the terms we had, right? The valuation we were asking for, everything looked fine. And then they sent us a term sheet where they had really crazy liquidation preferences. And this is not something we had agreed upon. And then as we were talking about getting the liquidation preferences to be normal, they said, oh, I have to get rid of my VP of sales and hire somebody's nephew because X, Y, Z. At that point, we called off the deal. Okay. So these things happen more often than you think. And then if you are, the other part is how many investors do you have? The more investors you have, the more you have to manage them. Each of them has put their money and trust in the company. And then you have to sort of make sure they are kept in the loop. You have to inform them of what's going on. And all of these things take time and energy. So investor management becomes a pretty big job of you, the CEO. Even if you have like 1 or 2 investors. Now for institutional investors like VCs, they tend to be pretty sophisticated and they have their own kind of metrics that they want you to report on. But if you have a large group of angels, small VCs, you may end up creating this communication vehicle and format to make sure they're kept in the loop and they're not surprised. And that's very important. You want to make sure they're not surprised. And you got bad news, share with them straight on. Because nothing destroys trust if they get surprised. And the sophisticated ones understand that there are lots of ups and downs along the way, but they don't want to be they don't want to feel like you withheld information or you did something not quite kosher. You want to control that. Okay. And the best way you control that is you set expectations. So, we used to do quarterly reports, essentially quarterly reports, like any other public company would do. So these were confidential. So we had, pretty much not exactly a 10K style thing, but all the basic material things we would report on. Plus, we also had a section where we say, here are the places where we are in need of help. So can you please help here, here, here? And that is actually a great approach because people, they do want to help you, but they don't necessarily know where you need help and where the help would be welcome. So being able to guide that makes a huge difference. And that was something that everybody liked, right? Going explicitly and asking for help. And that's something, frankly, you should get comfortable because this stuff is so hard, you've got to be comfortable asking for help. You've done all this analysis. Now, when you go out and try to raise money, I think you had a question also, what's the process like? You want to do significant work up front in creating, it's a bit like a sales campaign. If you've done sales, you get your prospects, you kind of figure out what your lead qualification criteria is going to be, and then you organize a campaign. And raising money of any kind, it's exactly the same process, right? Now, what are the things you want to have in your qualification criteria? The most important one is to understand, do they have money to invest? Okay? The websites get out of date. People can manipulate PR and press releases, but you need to know. And there are sources, financial resources, which will report on what kind of fund was raised, how much has already been invested.